Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name's Nick Salmond. I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide and one of over 600 members of the Guide London website. Usually at this time of year, we've been out guiding our clients around the attractions of London. But because of the lockdown here in the UK and around the world, we're not able to do that at the moment. So we've been doing these broadcasts regularly on a Monday, a Wednesday and a Friday at this time, 4 in the afternoon UK time, to try and bring a little bit of London to you in the hope that when the lockdown is over, you will come and visit us in person. We've been going for about 10 weeks now, so we've covered all kinds of subjects from history to culture. If you were able to join us on Wednesday, you would have heard a fascinating talk about Charles Dickens, the great author who died just over 150 years ago. If you've missed any of our broadcasts, then they are all archived on YouTube and on Facebook. All you have to do is go to YouTube, search for Guide London, and you'll find all our broadcasts are there. Please do share them with your friends. Please subscribe to our channel as well. Then you'll get a little alert to tell you when we have a new broadcast. Well, today we're talking about another Victorian, a very famous woman, and that is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was born just over 200 years ago. She was born on the 12th of May, 1820. So this year marks the 200th anniversary of her birth. She was very important in the development of healthcare in this country. And a lot of the innovations she brought in, a lot of the changes she made are still used in hospitals today. She's very well thought of. It's so much so that when the government built a series of emergency hospitals recently to cope with the COVID-19 epidemic here in the UK, they named these new hospitals after Nightingale. They're called the Nightingale Hospitals. Here you can see the picture of the hospital that was created in the east of London at what was an exhibition centre, the Excel Centre, one of 7 that was created around the country. If you're coming to London, you want to know a bit more about Florence Nightingale, then perhaps the best place to visit is the Florence Nightingale Museum. It's part of St Thomas's Hospital Centre of London. Now today, to talk about Florence and her works and her legacy, I'm joined by London Blue Badge tourist guide Paula Cooze. Now, Paula is going to tell us all about Florence Nightingale, about her history, about her legacy, and some of the reasons that she's still thought of as very important today. Paula is actually what we call the site liaison representative for the Blue Badge tourist guides with the Florence Nightingale Museum. Because we're not just Blue Badge guys, we don't just take people around London, we're trained with a 2-year course, and we work very closely with the various attractions we take people to make sure that our visitors get the best experience when they're in London. So Paula works very closely with the Florence Nightingale Museum. And I'm delighted to say we're also joined by David Green. Dave is the director of the Florence Nightingale Museum, so he works very closely with Paula. He's going to tell us a bit about the museum, about how the plans to mark the 200th anniversary of Nightingale's birth were progressing, the sort of things that were planned, and also tell you how you can still take part in some of those celebrations. And he'll be telling us about how the museum is coping with the COVID-19 lockdown and some of the plans when it reopens in the future. We are broadcasting live. So if you've got any questions about Florence Nightingale or the museum, then please do put it in the comments, either on Facebook or Twitter, and tell us where you're watching from in the world, and tell us if you've got any connections with Florence Nightingale as well. We'd love to hear those. So without more ado, I'm going to hand over to Paula, who's going to tell us all about Florence Nightingale. Paula.
Thanks, Nick. My name is Paula Cooze, and I'm a Blue Badge London tourist guide. I qualified in 2013. Prior to that, I worked in health and social care. In the social care setting, I'm something called a rehabilitation worker, which is a professional worker with the blind. And if you ask anyone who knows me what my passion is, I am absolutely passionate about guiding people with disabilities in London so that they get to see the wonderful sites that we all have access to, and also people from all around the world. So I guide the major sites and quite a lot of the smaller sites. Also, my background in public health really brought me into contact with Florence Nightingale, because although she's known in this country as the lady with the lamp, that's her famous iconic image, she's actually known all over the world, and we've got an image of Florence here as the mother of modern nursing. That's my details, and here comes Florence. Florence was born in 1820. and she died in 1910. So she lived a good long life through a period of enormous change. She's known, as say, throughout the world as the mother of modern nursing, because it was Florence who really put into practice a lot of the ways that nurses work today. And really she had to upgrade things, fight in the male world to get things changed. But in order to see just the influence of Florence, I like to call her Fabulous Florence because I think she's really quite amazing. Let's go back in time and see what nursing was like prior to Florence. And for this, I'm using this image. This is an image of a character from a Charles Dickens book, Martin Chuzzlewit. And as Nick was saying, if you watched the broadcast earlier in the week, you would have learned all about Charles Dickens. And this is Sarah Gamp. Sarah Gamp is a nurse. We're looking at a wonderful image here. She's sat on her chair, looking quite comfortable. On the table, a teapot and tea. Her umbrella stood there. But how does Charles Dickens describe Sarah Gamp? He describes her as untrained, incompetent, and drunk. Now have a look at the mantelpiece and look above the fireplace. You'll see a bottle of gin. And this was pretty much the state of nursing prior to Florence Nightingale. Nurses were untrained. There were no training schools for nurses. It was seen as a very low life occupation, often drunk, often unprofessional, and very little hygiene going on. So I love the fact that Dickens gives us this image of a nurse of the day. So how does Florence change all of that? Well, let's go to Florence, age 16. Florence in this picture, a young lady. She's born to a very wealthy family, very upper class family. And Florence, at the age of 16, meets at one of her mother's social events, the evangelical Christian. He has such an impact on her that she says she has a calling from God. Now, for most young women of Florence's background, that would probably mean going into a religious order, entering a nunnery. But Florence didn't want that. She wanted to do something where she cared for people. So she told her parents, I'm going to be a nurse. Now, her parents knew what nurses were of the day, so you can imagine their absolute horror at the idea of their daughter, their well-brought-up daughter, who was destined to be married in a place in society, entering the nursing trade, as it was. They thought, best thing we can do is try and dissuade her. Florence was very lucky because she was actually educated. You can see in this image, she's actually got a book in her hands. It was quite unusual for women to be educated at the first part of the 1800s. So her parents were quite forward-thinking. So they decided the thing to do was to send her away on a tour of Europe, where she could get all these notions of nursing out of her head. She went off, she visited Rome, she visited Greece, and she visited Egypt. She was fascinated by the history, the culture, the different religious traditions. If you look at the image, you'll see Florence as a Christian with the crucifix round her neck, the sign of the Christian church. But she was fascinated by other religions. She was really very broad-minded young lady. On her travels, she meets a man called Sidney Herbert. And this is him. He was on his honeymoon with his wife. It was a very, very fortunate meeting for Florence because she became lifelong friends with him and his wife. And he goes on to be a very important person. He becomes a member of Parliament and then Minister for War. When she returns from her travels, she is not dissuaded at all from wanting to be a nurse. And in 1850, she persuades her father. He eventually gives in. Florence is a very, very strong-minded woman, and she wants to do something. She's going to get it done. And she goes to Germany to train to be a nurse. There are no training schools in England at that stage. She trains as a nurse and works for 3 years in a clinic in Harley Street, the area of medical London still today, in a clinic for gentlewomen. 1853, war breaks out, and it's war in the Crimea. And this is the war between Russia, Britain and her allies, and Sidney Herbert is Minister for War. This is a very different war from previous wars because with wars that had happened before, it took a long time for information to come home from the front. So really people at home were somewhat removed from what was going on. What had happened before this war broke out, we have the invention of the telegraph, which means all those news reporters at the front are able to send information back very quickly. So the public have a real sense of what's going on. And basically, it's not good news. Let me give you an idea of the statistics from what was happening there. Of the people who died on the battlefield, we have 2,700. Yet we have 17,000 people who actually died of their wounds or disease. And that was all very bad news for Sydney because the public were in uproar. How can this happen to their soldiers? So Sydney remembers the lovely lady that he met on his travels, who is now a nurse. He calls on Florence Nightingale and he says, will you enlist a team of nurses and go and sort the Crimea out in terms of healthcare? Florence, we'll see here, riding proudly to the front line. This is a wonderful slide. This is Florence heading off to the outskirts of Istanbul in what is now modern Turkey, to the field hospital Scolari. And she sat in this wonderful carriage. Look at the speed at which it's going. You can see the dust kicked up by the horses. Look at the wooden wheels and look at the rough terrain. She must have been thrown about all over the place. But she heads off and she takes with her 38 nurses. The next slide, you can actually see the lists of the nurses. And at the very top, here's the list of all the nurses that went. And at the very top, you'll find the first name, nurse number 1, is Florence Nightingale. I love this. This is an exhibit from the Florence Nightingale Museum. And it's got this wonderful italic writing. I think it looks beautiful, but it's actually quite hard to read. And what the museum have got, they've actually got a digital copy of this, so you can actually blow it up large and you can read it a lot easier. But it lists all of those people, those 38 nurses that she handpicks to go off to the Crimea. Now, when she arrived, she's horrified. Conditions are appalling. Men are sleeping on the floor. It's filthy. It smells. There's horses stored in the basement underneath the hospital, so you have all the smell of the horses coming up. You can imagine this. Bandages with blood on them are left on beds. Beds are unmade, and it's overcrowded. And there's no clean water. So sanitation is poor, sewerage is poor, and also there's no money. So Florence sets about campaigning. And what she does is she writes home to the Times newspaper and she says, I need funds. And we can see in this slide what happened as a result of that, because we have the Nightingale Fund. The Times sent an appeal out for money to help Florence sort out the problems in the Crimea with the soldiers. And this raised thousands of pounds. The money came rolling in, but it also made Florence a household name. People now knew of Florence Nightingale. She used the money to buy materials to clean up the hospital, but she had a strategy. She had an action plan for how she was going to do this. And this was a 5-pronged approach. And we can see here her main focuses. The first one of them was actually to separate people, not to have everyone all over the place, but to have beds 3 feet apart. It's what we know today as social distancing. We're in that state at the moment. We all have to be 2 meters apart when we go out because infection can spread. And Florence understood this. So she wanted the soldiers separated out so the infections, you had some infection control, some barrier nursing there, as we call it today. She moved the horses out of the stable, got rid of the smell of the horses. She had the sewers mended, and she also set about cleaning everything. Florence was really keen on cleanliness and about making sure everything was clean. And again, if we resonate that back to today, it's hand washing. So when you've been out, you come in and you have to wash your hands to make sure you're not cross-contaminating anything. Florence was also probably what we would call today a fresh air freak. She believed in ventilation. So windows were thrown open and the whole ward was cleaned up. And here we have the cleaned up ward that Florence achieved. So this is an image of the ward in Scolari. And you can see the beds well spaced apart, no rubbish around, unused beds, the mattresses are rolled up, ready for the next patient, and the windows thrown open, so all that fresh air coming in. And we can actually see Florence in the centre with the superintendent, checking that everything is just spick and span. Now, Florence didn't only believe in physical improvements. Florence was one of the very first people to introduce something very different into nursing, and that is compassion. Now, this slide shows us probably the most famous image we have when we think about Florence, the lady with the lamp. And this is Florence, because what she would do is at night, she would actually go round all the different patients, speaking to them, actually showing interest in them, because we all know if you show compassion and interest, it helps with recovery. She would sit on their beds, listening to their stories, so they had someone to talk to, because they're all there very much alone. She would take dictation from the soldiers and write letters home to their family so their family knew what was happening to them. And perhaps most importantly, for those soldiers who died, she would actually write to their families afterwards. And when we think of Florence's action in the 6 months, the first 6 months she was in Scolari, the death rates dropped from 47% to 2%, which is quite an amazing statistic. But the letters she wrote home gave comfort to those families at home that weren't able to be with their loved ones when they died. And I think if we bring that up to date, that's something that's really happening on some of the isolation wards, the COVID isolation wards, where very sadly people are dying and they can't have their family need them because of the isolation, the risk of infection. And what the nurses and the healthcare workers are doing is they're actually sending cards to the families with all the names of the people who actually cared for someone. So that person becomes a real person and those care workers become a real person. And that is just so important in terms of grieving and not being able to be with your family. And I think that's just something amazing done today and amazing that Florence did. But it wasn't just compassion. Florence was really ahead of her time. What we have now is a little image of Jimmy. This is Jimmy, or really it's what remains of Jimmy. This is the shell of a tortoise, and Jimmy was the hospital pet in Scolari. And we have this wonderful quote from Florence: "A small pet is often a good companion for the sick." Florence understood mental health promotion way ahead of her time. She knew that if people had something that distracted them from their illnesses, it actually helped recovery. Let's go forward to today. And here we have pets as therapy. So what we have today is, this is actually a pet pug. And this is where animals are taken into hospitals, nursing homes and care homes, and people are able to pet them. And there is an abundance of evidence that this actually aids recovery and actually helps people get better quickly. This is a charity, the Pets as Therapy charity. So they do this. We've got their web address there if you're interested in finding out more about that. So we have this wonderful pets going on. Now, Florence stayed with the soldiers in Scolari, and she went home after the last patient had gone home. She was determined no one would be left behind. When she returns to England, she is fated. And what we can see with this slide, we've got the Nightingale Fund. Everyone has known about Florence. They all know who she is. Money has come rolling in. She is feted everywhere. She gets a medal from Queen Victoria, very unusual for a woman in those days to be awarded a medal. And people want to know her. They wanted to come to parties, to openings, to events. But Florence shuns this because she feels she still has work to do. The sad thing about Florence's leaving Istanbul Scolari is while she is there, she actually picks up an illness. She picks up a bacterial illness. And this is going to plague her for the rest of her life, which really means that she can't do active nursing for a lot of her life. It leaves her fatigued. It leaves her bedridden. And actually at one stage, she was 11 years in her bed. But this doesn't stop her because she decides there is work to be done on the nursing front. So she takes some of the money from the Nightingale Fund and she creates the first ever training school for nurses. And this is 1860. And she creates that in St Thomas's Hospital, just across the river from the Houses of Parliament. And a very nice little bit of information there is, if for our American viewers, I know we have quite a lot of American viewers, the first ever trained nurse, American trained nurse, was trained by Florence Nightingale. So you have a wonderful link to Florence there. And her name was Linda Richards. So first trained nurse, linked to Florence Nightingale. The book you're seeing on screen now is some of Florence's other work, because this is her most famous book, Notes on Nursing, written in 1858. But Florence actually wrote over 200 books and pamphlets throughout her time back in Britain. She was a campaigner on just about everything. We haven't got time to go into all of that now, but do go to the museum and see more. But her notes on nursing were some of the lessons that she had learnt from being in Scolari, and she wanted to write them down to give other nurses her experience. She talks about cleanliness, she talks about ventilation, her fresh air freakness coming out, and she talks about observation. Florence is the first nurse who actually does observation. Today we think that's very common, that's what nurses do. They would take your blood pressure, they will take your temperature, but it's Florence who actually instigate this. So you can really see her influence through to nursing. This book, interestingly, when I was researching this, I did some looking at some of the American nursing schools, and one of the things they recommend students before they enter the school is actually to read Florence's notes on nursing. So absolutely as relevant today as it always was. But another thing that Florence does, because Florence is a statistician, she loves statistics. And in this slide, what we get to see is how Florence puts those statistics into a form where we can all understand. Florence loves statistics, but what she knew, you need statistics as evidence in order to make change. But what she knew is most people did not like statistics. In fact, they turned off at the thought of rows of numbers. So she came up with this method of demonstrating evidence. And this she called a coxcomb. Today, we're actually quite familiar with this type of way of demonstrating evidence and statistics, pie charts. And also when we've been watching our COVID briefings, we quite often get diagrams looking like this. What Florence did here is this is a coxcomb that represents the casualties, mortality in the army in the East. And she's divided the year up into months. So we have 12 segments. You can see the names of the month running around the edge. Think of an orange with the segments coming out. And then she's used color coding to actually show the incidence of different causes of death. What this enables you to do is actually see when you have higher incidences in some months than others. If you're looking at allocating resources, then you allocate resources against need. And this is exactly how we work. When I worked in public health, that's very much what we were looking at. So I know some of my former colleagues are watching today, so this one is for you. Wonderful way of demonstrating information. But Florence is as relevant today as she always has been. And what I've taken for you now is 3 images from the exhibition that's on at the moment, Florence 2020, celebrating her 200 years. Look at the top image, the jar of beef tea, top left-hand side with the bird on it. This was beef tea, which was ordered by Florence from a shop in London, Fortnum & Mason, the Queen's grocer, no less, in Piccadilly, still there today, somewhere I always take all my visitors to. And what you can see is beef tea. And what you would do is you would spoon out a spoon of this substance, put it into a mug and put hot water on it, and you'd have a nourishing drink. You can still buy that in Fortnum & Mason's today, so it has lived throughout and past Florence. Beneath that, we have a Japanese comic, a manga comic, very, very topical and very modern. Have a look at the coloured images, and you'll see Florence tending to a sick man with a bandage on his head, and have a look at the lamp that she's holding. This is much more akin to the lamp that Florence really would have held. We tend to think of Florence with a lamp a little bit out of Aladdin, or a genie would come out of it. But actually in real life, the lamp that Florence had was far more the Turkish lantern side. So well done to Japan for getting the lamp right. And I also love the fact over on the right-hand side that Florence is a character in a video game, 2015, the Assassin's Creed. Who would have thought Florence in a video game? But I want to end my presentation with a really, really amazing image. This is an image by the street artist Bambi. And she wanted to do something right at the early stages when the outbreak was just happening in this country, in the UK. And she wanted to do something to thank all of the frontline workers, healthcare workers, who are really putting their lives at risk by going into work and working with people. It's right at the start of the campaign, and if you look at the slogan at the bottom, you can see it says, "Go with flow and stay home." That was when we were just going into lockdown. I love this image. You have Florence against a rainbow flag representing everyone, and she is the thoroughly modern miss. Look at the masks she's wearing. As of Monday next week, when we go out on public transport, we will be wearing these face masks. So Florence ahead of the game. In her hands, she has a Rubik cube. And I like to think that this represents Florence solving problems, making solutions. Also notice around her wrist, a blue band. Now, about 5 or 6 years ago in public health, we were producing these blue bands. If you were part of a campaign, Stop Smoking, Healthy Eating, you could wear these blue bands to show your support for it. So what Bambi has done is really put Florence in a very, very modern world. If you like this image, you can buy it. And the good news is a percentage of the money from the sale will actually be going to frontline workers. I think Florence would have absolutely loved this. And that is my presentation on Florence.
Paula, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. It's amazing, isn't it, how relevant a lot of Florence Nightingale's work is to what's going on in the health service today. Well, we're delighted to say that joining us today is David Green. Now, David Green is actually director of the Florence Nightingale Museum, that museum right in the centre of London, where you can learn all about Florence Nightingale. He's joining us to talk about the museum today. So, Dave, tell us a little bit about the Florence Nightingale Museum and what you can see there.
Hello there, and thank you for inviting me on. The Florence Nightingale Museum is commonly known as a real small gem amongst the rich myriad of museums in London's offer. But while small, I think we very much punch above our weight because it's a very popular place. We attract over 50,000 visitors each year now, and people come because Nightingale is ultimately such a popular character. You might get to meet our character who's portrayed there, our Nightingale actress, but we also have on display about 2,000 different objects from Nightingale's life. You've seen some of them in Paula's presentation there, and we've also got her lamp from Scutari Hospital. We've got Athena, the pet owl, but I was really pleased to see there that you did include the Register of Nurses, because that's just such a fascinating piece to see. And you can even come along if you know that you have a relative who went to Scutari with Nightingale and have a look. But I have to warn you that sometimes people don't find out what they expect, because undoubtedly Nightingale is a hard taskmaster. When you're good, she really does celebrate your achievement with her comments, and very, very gracious. But when you've perhaps not been so good, she has no hesitation, and she does send quite a few nurses home for being drunk, for being ill-mannered, because she really did want to lift those standards of nursing. And that's why she created a global profession, which we celebrate today, with stories right the way up to the current era about the nurses in St Thomas's Hospital.
And of course, this year being the 200th anniversary of her birth, you probably had a lot of things planned that you've been working up to for many years, and then the COVID-19 crisis came along. So tell us how that affected your plans and what you're doing to try and cope with that.
It certainly has affected years worth of planning. Since I've been at the museum 3 years ago, that's what we've been working towards. But we've really just had to show some true Nightingale spirit and knuckle down and get on with it. Now, we'd opened our temporary exhibition, Nightingale in 200 Objects, People and Places. We opened it just a week before closure. But realistically, we were very, very lucky because we've got an online version of that. You can see the website just there to log in. Actually, I said it's 200 exhibits, but it's just 199. And what we're asking you to do is nominate other things from anywhere in the world that you've seen with that Nightingale link. There's also a really good short film on there with our character actress telling more about Nightingale's story, where you'll also get to see inside her childhood homes. As well as that, we've got a variety of events that will still go ahead. We had a lot of activity in May that unfortunately was lost, but we're still hoping to hold a special evensong at St Paul's Cathedral and even take part in the Lord Mayor of London's show in November. So perhaps all's not lost, and we can still celebrate this very, very special year for nurses everywhere.
Indeed, it's great that there's so much online. As I say, the web address is up there, so do go and visit as well. There's also a GoFund page as well, because obviously a lot of the smaller museums rely on people visiting for their income. So people can go to the website, can they, and they can donate to the museum?
That's right. We have got the GoFundMe page that's advertised on the start of our website too, with an easy link through. There's also text giving. We're also going to be doing a charity auction with the BBC's Charles Hanson, a celebrity auctioneer who is passionate about Nightingale, really wants to get involved. So we've been got all sorts of donations for that, including something from Boris Johnson, the UK's Prime Minister, which I'll be collecting on Monday. So if people want to support us, it would be great if they can get involved.
And of course, Johnson was in St Thomas's Hospital, which is part of the same complex as the museum.
That's right, yes. We're actually built on the site of the nursing school. Unfortunately, that was destroyed during the World War. So we are in a modern building. Johnson was ICU, which is just over the way from us, but we work very, very closely with St Thomas's. They are our landlord. We've got a brilliantly mutually supportive relationship.
Now, I believe you can also get hold of a Florence Nightingale doll. Is that correct? Tell us all about that.
That's right. That was another one of our bicentenary projects. I was determined that the bicentenary would be for everybody. So at one end of the scale, we had talks and lectures like most museums do, including with the world expert on Nightingale, Professor Lynn MacDonald. But then another thing we did to engage different audiences was work with Mattel to create a Nightingale Barbie. And there she is. You can see her there. Now, Mattel were fantastic to work with because, firstly, this doll is included in their Inspiring Women series. Every year they launch this on International Women's Day and pick both contemporary figures and historic in order they can celebrate women from science, women from sport, arts and culture. And they really wanted Nightingale as both a nurse and mathematician. We worked with them to make sure that the dress was correct, hairstyle appropriate, etc. We added the Scutari sash because that's one of the biggest achievements in starting nursing uniform. And of course, we insisted that the right lamp was used. And Mattel really were keen to get those details right. I've got one here. We sell them in our shop and we've only got a very limited number. They're only available to the English-speaking world. In fact, the one I had just there we'll be using in our auction because Mattel actually gave it to us and it's a special one because it's actually the prototype, the final version. On this one, the features are hand painted. So we'll be auctioning that to try and save the museum when we work with Hanson's next Friday on our live auction.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for telling us about the museum. Hopefully people will come and visit once the lockdown is over. We've had a few comments in. Steve Fallon here saying that he thinks the invitation to nominate the 200th Nightingale object is very, very cool. There's lots of comments thanking you for the information. There is a few nurses have commented. Someone was a nurse from Canada actually who's come to visit the museum. Do you get a lot of medical professionals coming to visit the museum?
We certainly do. I wouldn't want to put anybody off who's not a medical professional because everybody enjoys it. But around 65% of our visitors are actually nurses. One of the fantastic things to see is how many nurses come and almost pay homage to Florence. Some even bring flowers and put next to a statue we have of her. And then they often find each other just talking to each other about their careers, about what it's like to nurse in different countries. And we're honoured that people use us in that way. Equally, tourists love to come find out about such a fascinating character. And we love working with the Blue Badge Guides to introduce us to all sorts of different audiences. And that's why we're really keen that post-pandemic, in this very strange world that we're in, we keep working together really, really closely, support each other, and actually you're very welcome still to bring groups to us. Please do get in touch with me about that because we know it's difficult for you to do and we've got to work together and help each other just as Nightingale would have wanted.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, Dave, and for filling us in about the museum. We hope to be bringing our guests to see you and learn about Florence Nightingale very, very soon. And thank you to Paula as well. To telling us so much about Florence Nightingale. Thank you for joining us here on Guide London. If you want to know more about Paula, if you want to know about any of the tours that we do on Guide London, then go to our website. It's guidelondon.org.uk. You can find out all the information there. Check out the Florence Nightingale Museum on their website as well. Don't forget you can donate money to the museum to try and help it during this current period. We'll be back on Monday. This weekend marks the official birthday of Her Majesty the Queen. She has a real birthday in April. She has an official one in June. And we'll be talking about that on Monday. We'll be talking about the Troop in the Colour, which usually takes place this coming weekend. It's a slightly curtailed version is taking place at Windsor this year. We'll hear about that. And we'll be talking about some of the properties that the Queen owns around the country as well. So join us for that. From Dave, from Paula, and from me, though, thank you for joining us today. And we'll say goodbye for now. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.